In this episode of the Cole Memo, I'll be sitting back down with Dana Larsen. You can check out the first episode I recorded with Dana in the show notes. I'll also have a link to Dana's website and so much more in the show notes. So do be sure to check out the show notes. I did say doobie. Spark it up. Enjoy this episode of the Cole Memo featuring Dana Larsen. All right, Dana, thank you for sitting back down with me on the Cole Memo. I'm going to give you the space to reintroduce yourself in a moment. Today is October 20th, 2024. I'm displaying Dana's Twitter right now if you want to connect with them online. And Dana, why don't you go ahead and remind my audience who you are and what you do, my friend? And then we'll get into the heart of today's conversation.
Sure. Well, I'm an activist for ending the war on drugs, mainly focused on cannabis and psychedelics these days. I run the medicinal mushroom dispensary in the Coca Cafe, and we are the only shops in the world where you can come in and as long as you're a responsible adult, you can buy not only psychedelic mushrooms, but LSD and DMT and kratom and coca leaf when we have it, and other interesting psychedelics like 2CB as well. And I'm very proud of what we do, but there's certainly a lot of challenges involved, including having the police come in and take all your stuff, which happened for the second time just a couple of days ago.
Yeah, and that's a good way to just dive right in. I've actually got some pictures that I'm about to share in video. It looks like that you captured, but do you mind giving us kind of a rundown? And this isn't your first time, right? But can you give us a rundown this latest thing that
We've been
happened to you?
open for about 5 years now, since 2020, early 2020 when we first opened. And some people ask, well, how do you get away with this? And how are you able to do all this? And shouldn't you get arrested? And I mean, we're in Vancouver, and Vancouver has a city police force, which, although I got some issues with them, they are more responsive to the desires of the community than like the RCMP or our national police force would be. But and I'm not the only one. There's at least 20 other mushroom dispensaries in the city, but I'm the only one that also sells other psychedelics. I'm also the only one that puts my face and my name out there on the news and in the media and represents directly. Most of the other ones are kind of anonymously run. But last year, in November 1st, we got raided for the first time. The Vancouver police came in en masse. We had three locations at that time, and they raided all three of them. And I was detained at the police station for about 8 hours or so, but ultimately I was released with no charges or conditions. But they emptied out our store and cost us a very significant amount of money and lost product, and makes your customers nervous to come and shop with you when you get raided as well. So there's that kind of an issue. But we rebuilt from that and got ourselves going again. And now it's almost a year later. They like to do their raids in October, November. So they came back. We only have two locations right now, but they only raided one of them this time. I'm not quite sure why they only picked one and not the other one, but they came in, took all our stuff. I wasn't detained this time because I wasn't there and I didn't go down there. My lawyer said if you go down there, they're going to detain you and possibly put conditions on you, and you want to avoid that. But yeah, it's very challenging. It costs a lot of money. It's psychologically difficult, and it's hard on our staff as well. And we also run a program called Get Your Drugs Tested, which is the world's busiest free street drug analysis program. It costs us a ton of money to run this thing. And it's really where we put most of our revenues from this business. But it makes it challenging to keep that going when they come in and do a devastating financial raid like this. But we're survivors and we're continuing. We reopened again the next day and we're continuing our work. And we'll see if any charges come out of this, and hopefully not. But it's hard to say what's going to happen, and we have to roll with the punches.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for what you do because I know it is definitely hard for you, but the reason I'm thanking you is because I have to imagine this is a curveball for your customers too, the people that rely on you, not only for your safe testing services, but for the ability to acquire safe product.
Yeah, it makes our customers nervous, and it's hard on our staff as well. They don't like having the police coming in and threatening and harassing them, and some of them got handcuffed for a brief moment or two before they were ultimately released. I mean, I've been doing this kind of work all of my adult life. I'm in my early 50s now, and I started this kind of stuff when I was 18, 19 years old. I've seen, back in the 90s, they would raid bong shops in Canada. Bong and pipe and grow books and things like that were illegal. And a lot of those early raids, it was the same kind of thing back in those days, especially in Vancouver, but other cities too. The police would usually come in, take all your bongs and pipes and grow books, but charges were very rare because they knew these laws weren't really constitutionally sound. And in fact, we did defeat the law on the prohibition on literature with a court challenge. And I think that's maybe part of the reason why they're not charging us or charging me now for these kind of raids is because they know we have good lawyers. They know we're going to launch a major constitutional challenge if there was charges put on us. We might even win and possibly overturn some of these laws in the Supreme Court. And it'd be very expensive and time consuming for the government to bring these charges forward. Although they couldn't do it, they've got infinite resources if they want to. But I can't read their minds. But I think the reason they're not charging us is because the real penalty is in the seizure and taking all your stuff, right? The
Right.
process is the penalty, and it's much easier. And in fact, maybe profitable for them. They, not profitable, but they take a lot of cash. They took, a couple of tens of thousands of dollars out of our bank machine and out of our safe and the money in the till and all of our products and everything. And that can be even more devastating than going to court in a way. So, I'm glad not to get charged. And we said we reopen the next day and continue our work, but this is not easy. But there's a reason why we're the only store like this in the world, right? It's not easy to do this kind of work anywhere. It's easier in Vancouver, but still very difficult here. In a lot of other jurisdictions, we would get treated a lot more harshly. I appreciate being in a city where the penalties and the enforcement is not so strict, even though we do get tagged and get raided and that. But we're survivors. We'll continue to do what we do, and we try to learn from these situations and try to make ourselves more raid proof and take precautions and things like that. But ultimately, it's the cost of doing business in this kind of industry. And for me, this isn't just a business. This is a way of life. This is a mission. I don't run this business because I want to sell psychedelics per se. I run this business because I believe the war on drugs is a evil policy that causes a great deal of harm and death and misery around the world, and that psychedelics especially are useful, beneficial substances. They have some risks, but they have incredible benefits when used properly. And I'm very proud to make these things available to people that need them, whether it's for therapeutic use and psychological use, whether they've got trauma or PTSD or depression or other issues they're working on, or whether they're just someone who wants to go camping and enjoy some mushrooms by the fire instead of drinking alcohol. And I think those are all very valid uses, like with cannabis. A lot of people use cannabis recreationally and for fun. A lot of people use it for medical use. Sometimes the line between what is medicinal and what is recreational is kind of a fuzzy one, right? But
Right.
I meet folks every day who are very grateful that our shops exist, who have tell me how our work and the presence of these materials that we're able to sell has changed their lives for the better in all sorts of ways. And I think the work we're doing is important, and I'm going to continue as long as I'm able to do so.
Yeah. And so do you think that like sounds like that's almost like you described it as the cost of doing business. Do you foresee them kind of like you say continuing to delay a actual legal challenge against what you're doing because they know they're going to lose? Like,
I mean, it's not a slam dunk or anything. If we did go to court, it would be a challenging
sure,
process, and it's not, but there are, like with cannabis, we used to win on cannabis cases a lot too about medical use and medical access, and we've also had other angles taken against us with the city coming after our business licenses and trying to take away our business licenses and challenging us in that way, trying to fine us and threaten our landlords and things like that. And we've also been very successful in winning a lot of those cases. In fact, city council earlier this year, our Vancouver City Council even ordered the chief license inspector to return our business license at our second location on Broadway Street. The license inspector said we had done misconduct, we were selling illegal drugs, and this and that. And the city councilors, it was like a very luckily chosen three of the 10 city councilors, and we have only two Greens, and the rest are all this right wing ABC party. And we happened to get our three that are randomly chosen. We got two Greens and one ABC. And so we had a majority of the progressive councilors. But that was a fabulous decision. And of course, they didn't give us our license back. The chief license inspector refused an order from city council and just said, we're not going to do that. I don't care what they tell me, which is kind of wrong. They're supposed to do what they're told by city council.
right.
But it just shows that, there's a lot of hostility there on that level. Although a lot of people, I think, in our community, certainly we have widespread support. People come in all the time to live in our neighborhood, neighboring businesses, things like that are all very happy that we're there also. And we have a lot of political support too, but we do have our challenges as well. And this really sort of reminds me of the 90s when they were raiding bong shops and going after people for selling bongs and pipes and cannabis seeds and things like that. Now cannabis is legal in Canada. I don't see too many Canadians clamoring to go back the cannabis prohibition or saying that it was wrong or anything like that. And so for me, it's just the same thing all over again. It's deja vu all over again when it comes to this, the prohibition on psychedelics, the way they're enforcing these laws, the fact that these are really very beneficial, useful medicines with lots of positive uses, and the risks, although there are some risks, those risks are very minimal, certainly compared to the risks of alcohol or tobacco or things like that that we take for common, I take for granted. And so, we're going to continue. And I think ultimately we're going to win. We won with cannabis. It took us many years to get there, but we overturned the cannabis laws in Canada, and we're going to overturn these psychedelic laws as well. And ultimately, the whole drug war is going to crumble if I have anything to do with it.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. And on that note, as much as you can, um, tell me a little bit about like some of the issues that have come up with you recently. Cause it's funny, in between the last time I talked to you and now, I interviewed somebody from Canada who claimed, and I don't even remember who this person is off the top of my head, but they reminded me of you because they were like, I'm the first person other than Coca-Cola that has access to the Coca leaf in and of itself. Turns out they weren't doing exactly the same thing that you're doing. But you did mention earlier having issues getting coca leaf. Like with that and anything else, like what does that look like from your perspective? Like again, I'm not trying to ask you like who's your plug, but like why
Oh,
is that
well,
difficult?
Well, I mean, all the other products from cannabis or mushrooms and psychedelics, they're all made in Canada,
Fair.
grown in Canada. Mushrooms are actually very easy to grow. Like with cannabis, it's not hard to grow cannabis. Growing immaculate world-class buds or incredible mushrooms is a bit challenging, but they're not that hard ultimately to produce these things.
Yeah.
But coca leaf we import from other countries. And last year in May, I was in the news talking about coca leaf, and because I'm mouthy and I'm honest in the media, maybe to a fault, I explained how we import coca leaves from Peru and Bolivia and Colombia and other countries there and bring it into Canada. And under the Canadian law, coca leaf and cocaine and crack, it's all on the same schedule. It's all Schedule 1, just like opium poppies and fentanyl are all in Schedule 1 also, right? They don't rate it by potency or by danger. They rate it by the substance class. And I don't believe in these drug schedules at all. But the idea that they consider coca leaf, chewing coca leaf, or drinking coca tea, like I'm doing right now, to be comparable to snorting cocaine or smoking crack, it's not the same thing, right? But it's a challenge bringing in this. We have to smuggle it in, right? And it's not easy to do that. And after so I was on the news about May, not last year. And when the police raided us in November last year, they said we began the investigation in June. And I believe that it was the coca leaf media hit that put us over the top. Everything else we sell is in the same category as mushrooms, the LSD and the 2CB and the DMT and all that. That's all Schedule 3, still illegal, but not considered as serious as a Schedule 1 drug, right? And so, although the police don't tell you, well, this is what triggered the raid, they leave it to you to guess. But I think it was about coca leaf. But now, once we're in the system and we get raided last year, now they're investigating, now they're looking at us more, so it can trigger other raids in the future. But I believe in coca leaf. I think it's a wonderful leaf. It's very beneficial in a lot of ways. And it's got, millions of people in South America use coca leaf to chew or to drink tea every single day, and they're all fine. And in that way, it's kind of comparable to coffee and caffeine and coffee beans and that kind of thing, right? But it's a very challenging thing. And so since that raid happened, they were able to figure out a little more about how we bring it into the country. They've been attacking our supply lines more. Customs has been more challenging. They've cracked down on it more. And so my coca leaf supply has really dried up. And I haven't given up on this yet. We do get the odd package in and everything, but I haven't got enough to like get the Coca Leaf Cafe really back on its feet as a coca, just place people can access coca leaf. We've had no coca leaf at the Coca Leaf Cafe for a few months now, which is a big problem. But we got to roll with the punches, and you got to be adaptable. And
Yeah.
so instead of coca leaf, we've been bringing in more. I call them microdose shooters at our cafe. Sort of single hits of microdoses like that people can try. We've added a bunch of new interesting ones in there. Some of your more astute viewers might have heard of like 4-HOMET or 4-ACO-DMT and things like that we sell as microdose shooters and take-home bottles. But I'm committed to coca leaf. We're going to get it back in the country again, but it's a big challenge and it takes some time and effort. And I can't really talk about the details of how we want
Sure.
to do that, of
Is it
course.
hard to
But
grow like in a like cannabis?
well, because cannabis is an annual plant, right? So it grows
Yeah.
quickly and it's done in 1 year and then it dies, right? Coca plants, they grow much more slowly. They live a long time. A coca bush will live to 50 or 60 years. It will grow 2 or 3 times your height at its if you let it grow that tall. It's in a tropical equatorial environment, so it doesn't really
Sure.
have a seasonal aspect. It's not affected by light cycles like cannabis is, where the flowering and all that is
Right.
affected by the light cycle. Coca plants, if you see them in the wild, they're growing there. They'll have like they make berries, and each berry's got one single seed in it. And you'll see them with like flowers and ripe berries and overripe berries and all that, all in the same plant all the time. They're constantly making new berries. But the problem with coca seeds, unlike most seeds, you can't dry out and store coca seeds. They need to be planted quite quickly because they're like a lot of seeds are designed to fall off the plant in the fall and survive the winter and grow next spring. But so they are designed to be stored, right? But coca seeds are designed to fall off the tree and start growing again right away. So you can't really store them. So bringing coca seeds to Canada to grow, you can do it, but you got to be quick and it's challenging and you get a low germination rate. You can clone coca plants, but also it's a very woody kind of a plant, so it's tricky to clone. It's very challenging. I have grown coca in Canada for a while. I think I might have been the biggest coca grower in Canada with like 50 plants going or something. And I started selling the plants to our customers. I kind of regret doing that now. I should have probably grown them bigger and made clones and tried to sell clones, but for a while, a couple of years ago, we were selling coca plants pretty regularly. You can grow them in Canada, but you can't let them get cold. So you can't grow them outdoors except in the middle of the summer, right? If they get cold, they lose all their leaves and then they die pretty fast, right? So you can grow them in Canada indoors under lights, or put them out in the summer, then bring them in the winter. But they're finicky plants. They're not really designed for this kind of climate, and you get a fair amount off them, but economically you make a lot more money off a cannabis plant, or you used to anyways, when cannabis was more expensive, than you can off a coca plant growing it indoors under lights in a greenhouse or in a basement or whatever. So it's really a plant meant to be grown outdoors in a different kind of way. I'm growing some, but growing enough coca plants to supply a storefront
Sure.
is very difficult, right? That's my dream, but it's very difficult. And because of all the challenges, I've kind of put the coca on the back burner a bit right now, so I can focus on the psychedelics and other things we bring in. But I believe in coca. It was really a small part of our business. Like the coca sales were less than 10% of our overall sales, right? So in a sense, the effort we put into coca wasn't really financially worth it compared to everything else. But for me, coca leaf is so wonderful, and I think Canadians and everybody needs to learn more about coca and what it is, because cocaine and crack are very demonized substances. But the reality is, coca leaf is really beneficial. It's positive, and I think that I really believe that if we lived in a world or a parallel world where coca had never been prohibited, but coffee beans had been. And certainly there's been times in history when coffee has been considered a subversive drink and coffee beans and coffee have been prohibited. And you can buy pure caffeine and you can snort it and inject it if you want to. And you'll get really high if you do that. But 99.999% of caffeine users choose not to consume their caffeine that way because they drink coffee or energy drinks, maybe take a caffeine pill if they really want a strong effect. But most people just take it in drinks. And I think if coffee was illegal and prohibited and coffee beans were treated like coca leaf, coffee wouldn't be available. And the only way to consume caffeine would be to snort it or to smoke it or things like that. That would increase. Meanwhile, if coca leaf was entirely legal and available, the money would not be in snortable cocaine. Most coca users would not want to snort cocaine. It's not a very pleasant way to use this substance. It's because of prohibition that it gets used that way. If cocaine and coca leaf were just as legal as caffeine and coffee beans are, 99.99% of cocaine users would be consuming it in the form of coca tea and drinks and beverages. If you liked a lot of it, you'd have a really strong energy drink with coca in it, and that would be the way they consumed it. And snorting coca and snorting cocaine would be about as common in that world as snorting caffeine is now. You don't need a law
Right.
against snorting caffeine to discourage people from snorting caffeine. You just need safer options and better options available. And so, I think we'll be the same with cocaine, that there'd be some folks that still want to snort it, but the vast majority of users would take it in a better way. And drinking coca tea is much more pleasant and enjoyable than snorting cocaine is as well. It's a much better way to take it. And I've certainly had customers come in and tell me, like, I'm a cocaine user. When I drink your coca tea, I don't use as much cocaine. Or I'm an Adderall addict. I had one guy explain to me he was taking a lot of Adderall and couldn't control his use. And he stopped using Adderall by microdosing and drinking coca tea. And so that to me is a wonderful story of how this can benefit people, right? And so I believe in coca and coca tea. For cannabis aficionados, we sometimes call cannabis the tree of life. If you're really into it, you call cannabis a tree of life. Well, the word coca, means tree. It means the tree. And it is Coca is the primordial tree, the archetypical tree or the platonic tree. This plant that has been an integral part of indigenous cultures across South America for thousands of years, since long before Europeans came in and started making cocaine out of it. They call it Mama Coca or Pachamama and Pachacoca as a kind of got a goddess sort of spiritual aspect to it in the same way that we see cannabis and other plants as having a spiritual aspect to them in many ways. And so, for North Americans who only ever experience coca in the form of cocaine, your perception of it is very different. And sometimes it's hard to see that in this white powder, you're actually looking at a plant extract, and that the plant in its more natural form or in a more mildly concentrated form is actually more medicinal value, more spiritual value, healthier, and a more pleasant and enjoyable experience than taking it in that raw form. Just like pure THC is less pleasant for most people than smoking a joint or the full
Right.
spectrum of cannabinoids. And in coca, cocaine is only one of many alkaloids. And by itself, yeah, it's got some effects. It can be pleasurable and can be stimulating, but it's really better with all the alkaloids together in a wider spectrum. You get a much better effect, just like you get a much better effect from whole cannabis. It's much more enjoyable when you've got THC and CBD and CBG and CBN and all this together in different ratios. The effect is both more medicinal and more pleasant. Well, the same with cocaine. Pure cocaine, yeah, like pure THC, it's got some aspects to it, but really the real benefit is when you got all the range of alkaloids that all have synergistic effects with each other and can work together in a complementary kind of way. And you get that from chewing coca leaf or drinking coca tea.
Right. Well, and what's interesting is one of the things I learned, I believe, from you is that just to add to your point, and I want to see if you have any thoughts to add on this, like it seems like all of these concentrated forms of any drug are a result of prohibition. I believe you taught me about the iron law of prohibition. And so, like, you just gave the example of like cocaine, even cannabis concentrate, heroin. The reason these like concentrated forms are become popular is not only like, yes, there are some perks to having a like a let's call it a pure dose, but it's also all of these forms are easily concealable, shippable, and discreet.
Yeah,
It's kind of interesting.
because of prohibition, the market is less about what customers want and more about what smugglers can bring in, right? And so, and you even see this with cannabis, in areas where cannabis is really strictly prohibited, it sometimes gets replaced by synthetic cannabinoids and stuff like spice or whatever, right? Which is a cannabis substitution project where they take synthetic cannabinoids, which are much cheaper and easier to produce, often much stronger and less pleasant than real cannabis. But cannabis is stinky and bulky and hard to work with. You got some chemicals you can spray onto some leaf and make a cannabis substitute, but that can be quite harmful as well. And in areas where cannabis is legal, nobody wants spice. Nobody wants synthetic cannabinoids when they can have real cannabis. During alcohol prohibition, it was easier to get bathtub gin and methyl alcohol, which could make you go blind or kill you instantly. Much more easy to get that than to get a beer or a glass of wine. And if you look at our other policies, when it comes to coca, for instance, it's much easier to buy cocaine and crack than it is to buy coca leaf or coca tea. It's much easier to buy fentanyl than it is to get opium or opium tea or products like that are milder. And so a good drug law should make it easier to get the milder form and harder to get the more dangerous form. A good drug policy should make it easier to get beer and wine than to get methyl alcohol and bathtub gin. It should make it easier to get raw marijuana than to get synthetic cannabinoids, and easier to get opium tea than it is to get heroin or fentanyl. But our drug laws do the exact opposite. They remove the milder, easier choices and they replace them with only the most dangerous ones. And the reality is, most users prefer milder forms of these things. If you look at cannabis, what's the biggest area of growth in cannabis post legalization? Is it in incredibly strong edibles that have psychedelic like effects and get you super high? No, people don't want that. It's in CBD products is the biggest area of growth in cannabis, the non-psychoactive form. Now the psychedelics are becoming more mainstream. What's the biggest area of growth? Is it heroic doses of huge amounts where you're getting going up to the moon and you can barely talk because you're so high? No, it's microdosing is the biggest area of growth. Tiny dosages that have very minimal, very beneficial, but very small effects. And with legal drugs like caffeine, like I said, you can go snort caffeine, you can inject caffeine, no laws against that at all, entirely legal. But who wants to do that? The odd person maybe, but the vast, vast majority of users want a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or an energy drink or something. They want much milder forms, right? And so, prohibition does the exact opposite of what it claims to be doing, right? It makes everything worse. It makes the milder forms less available, the safer forms less available. People will often say to me, well, when they talk about legalizing drugs, well, you want to legalize fentanyl, and they'll always pick the strongest, most dangerous thing. You can't, methamphetamine. It's like, no, these things, you don't need to prohibit them to make them not used. You just need to offer safer, milder forms, and the vast majority of users will go for that. If you really need fentanyl, there should be a clean supply of that available for you. But vast majority of users do not want that at all. That's not what they're looking for. It's what they're forced to use because of prohibition. And so I think that's important to keep in mind for people, that prohibition is what pushes these more risky forms, more dangerous forms, and legalization and regulation and education and just general human nature leads us to the milder forms when those are available. And that's a big part of what I try to promote and educate people about, Coca tea and coca leaf is very, very beneficial to people, has a lot of positive aspects to it.
Yeah. Yeah, just to shortly add, fentanyl really is one of the best examples. Like my mom just went through a surgery and they had to administer fentanyl, and it's like a beautiful drug in that way that it can be used so effectively in hospitals. But yeah, as you say, like when it spills onto the streets through like just pure demand, and it, like you say, it's the easiest thing to smuggle almost. Like really it is. We've all seen the picture of the little dime and how much it takes, how much
It's
fentanyl it takes to
exactly
kill
the
somebody.
same as the synthetic cannabinoids with cannabis, right? That they
Yeah,
take a little bit of space. And I run Get Your Drugs Tested, right? And we're very busy. And it's not even about fentanyl per se. Like if fentanyl didn't exist, we would still have all the same problems with prohibition, right? And in
sure.
fact, even the fentanyl is not clean. People come in with what they think is fentanyl, and it's got benzodiazepines in it. It's got a xylazine in it and things like that, right? So not even the fentanyl is clean. The fentanyl itself is contaminated with other drugs as well. And benzodiazepines produce overdoses that are caused in a different way than opioid overdoses. So Narcan, naloxone, doesn't work on a
Wow.
benzo overdose, right? It affects you very differently. And you might be an opiate user seeking opiate use for your pain relief, because these things are incredible pain relievers. And then you find out you've been doing benzodiazepines without even knowing it. And now you've got a withdrawal symptoms from benzos, which you weren't even seeking. So it's a prohibition is the cause of all these problems, right? And if without prohibition, we wouldn't be in the situation. The biggest mistake was shutting down the opium parlors and opium lounges over 100 years ago. I'm not saying opium is harmless or anything like that, but certainly on the spectrum of opioids, it is the least risky and the least, I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and you can search newspaper headlines and articles going back hundreds of years, really, and you find virtually no mention. So the odd mention of an opioid related death prior to prohibition, very, very, very rare. They happened, but they were very rare. With 100 years of prohibition, pretty much every decade has seen more overdose deaths and drug poisoning than the decade before. And it's like the frog in the boiling water, because this happened slowly over the course of 100 years. We haven't really noticed it. When alcohol prohibition came in and deaths from alcohol began soaring immediately, within a year or two, deaths from alcohol were soaring, and it's safer. And certainly there's problems with drinking alcohol. I'm not saying alcohol is totally safe or everyone should drink all the time, and alcohol can cause a lot of problems, but all those problems were exacerbated and worsened by prohibition. And people went from drinking beer and wine to drinking bathtub gin and methyl alcohol, and blindness and death and public drinking and public consumption and corruption of police forces and all these things, and the rise of organized crime. All the things we're seeing here now happened with alcohol prohibition, but they happened over the course of a few years instead of several decades. So it was easy to see in your own lifetime how things had gotten worse, and how those who had honestly believed and correctly that alcohol caused a lot of problems and thought the solution to that was to ban it, they all began to see that their dream had turned out to be a nightmare, and that their dream of an alcohol-free world and that prohibition would work to stop people drinking alcohol and eliminate the problems caused by alcohol didn't have that effect. In fact, it made everything worse. And many people who, with good intentions, had supported alcohol prohibition turned against it when they saw how bad things had gotten and how this was not helping families, it was not helping reduce alcohol consumption, it was not helping create a more stable, safer society. It was increasing alcohol consumption, increasing the death and the misery, and corrupting the police, corrupting governments, ruining societies, causing more public drinking, more violence, more chaos, more gang violence, all these things we see coming out of the prohibition of other drugs that we have now. This is all the same situation. And there are issues around drug use, certainly. There's issues around everything, but the way to reduce those is through education, through regulation, through making sure that the products people have are safe and controlled in that way, instead of just demonizing all these substances and attacking people who use them. In many ways, drug users are the last group in Western society that you're allowed to hate officially. There's certainly many people who are racist and homophobic and things like that, but it's typically not government policy. Maybe in some American states or whatever, but certainly in Canada, every government supports gay rights, supports LGBT community, supports racial equality. But when it comes to drug users, there's still a group where you can demonize. They need forced treatment. There's something wrong with these people. Why can't they just drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes like the rest of us? Why do they need opiates? Why do they need psychedelics? Why do they want to do this stuff? Let's put them in forced treatment. I really believe that forced treatment for drug users will have as much of an effect on stopping the drug death crisis as forced treatment for homosexuals had on stopping the AIDS crisis and those kind of problems, right? They're not exactly the same. The parallel's not exactly the same, but certainly this idea that we can force someone to treatment, then we'll make them normal if we just push them hard enough. No, drug use is normal. Drug use is natural.
Right.
It's prohibition that is abnormal, and prohibition that causes these behaviors to spiral out of control as a result of the prohibition and the punishment and the shame and the social stigma attached to it. That's what drives people into these harmful kind of behaviors.
Yeah. And by the way, that I took a note. Did you say the newspaper's subscription you have? Is that how you I've always been inspired by some of the content you've created. It's specifically one that we talked about last time, the myth of increased cannabis potency. Is that kind of how you found all that information?
Yeah, newspapers.com is a great website.
Nice.
It's very helpful. You can search all North American newspapers by keyword and find things. Yeah, I did a search on like cannabis potency, and I
Hmm.
discovered that they've been claiming marijuana is stronger than ever for about 100 years, since the 1930s. And in the 30s, they were also saying marijuana would drive you insane and turn you into a murderer and a psychotic person. And if you add up all the times they've said it's stronger than it used to be, it's double the strength. It's 5 times the strength. It's 20 times stronger. If you add all those up, it's like 20,000 times stronger or something than it used to be, which is obviously absurd, right?
Right.
And it's kind of meaningless as well, but it shows the ridiculousness. But this is always the attack on people because they know that you smoked marijuana when you were younger and you were fine. So the only way to convince you, well, it's not the same as what you had now. It's way more
You're
dangerous.
right.
What you smoked isn't the same. It's the way of convincing people who were cannabis users when they were young, who they got kids of their own and they worry about their kids. Fair enough. And instead of them thinking, well, I smoked marijuana, I was okay, they want to tell you, no, it's stronger now, it's more dangerous now, it's worse now. And you can only do so much to a plant. The real way to make cannabis more dangerous and stronger and deadly is to replace it with synthetic cannabinoids, which does happen and which is a health risk and causes a lot of problems. But the idea that you can make a plant 20,000 times more potent than it used to be, and of course, hashish and extracts have always been around. So that's really what makes cannabis stronger. In fact, in a way, in the modern world, the way we use cannabis is much milder because for most of human history, cannabis was not smoked. It was eaten and consumed as an edible. And as we know, edibles can produce effects far, far
Hell
stronger than
yeah.
smoking. And that's another example of how users tend to want the milder form. I smoke a lot of cannabis. I don't really like edibles. Once in a while, I'll have an edible, but I don't take edibles every day. They're too strong. I don't
Hmm.
want that effect. A few puffs off a joint, that can be kind of strong, but for most people, that's pretty mild. And most users only want a few puffs. They get to where they want, and they're happy. 99.99% of cannabis users do not want to eat really strong edibles. Some do if they got medical needs, especially that can be really helpful for those having really strong edibles for medical purposes. But for most people who want to have a pleasant time, a few puffs up a joint is what they need, right? And it's always prohibition that turns these things into these dangerous synthetic concentrated forms. If you're in the opium business or the heroin business, and you got the choice between having a fields and fields of opium poppies, and you got to pay farmers, and you got to worry about police and helicopters spraying pesticides and coming in and burning your crops. You got to negotiate with farmers. You got to bring this stuff, concentrate it down to opium, then to heroin, and then to other things to be able to smuggle it. That's a lot of work. You can have two guys doing a Walter White in the cabin in the woods somewhere making fentanyl, where a few grains is equal in value and potency to a much larger quantity of heroin. Well, of course, you're going to go to that. It's not a question of morality or anything else. It's merely a question of what's more profitable, what works better. When I smuggle in my coca leaf, I always joke, right? If I was smuggling cocaine, it'd be much easier, much more
Right.
profitable. Smuggling whole coca leaf is ridiculous. Like I only do it because I'm ideologically a believer in coca leaf, but economically and risk wise and everything else, it makes no sense to
Yeah,
smuggle in
because it's
coca
like
leaf.
they're kind of big leaves, right? Like, is
They're
that,
big leaves and they're obvious, and the profit margin
yeah,
on coca leaf is a lot smaller than the profit margin on pure cocaine.
sure.
You know,
Because you can
an
just
ounce of
pack it in,
cocaine, yeah,
you
an
know?
ounce of cocaine. Listen, I don't smuggle cocaine. I have no desire to do that, but an
Yeah.
ounce of cocaine makes you as much profit as many kilos of coca leaf would.
Mhm.
So why would anyone smuggle coca leaf? Even though it's safer and better and healthier, and users might like it better, the profit margins are just not there, right? Why would
Yeah.
anyone smuggle opium when they can smuggle fentanyl, you know, and they're all on the same drug schedule, and one is going to make you millions of dollars more in a tiny little space, and the other one it's very bulky and challenging to smuggle, and so it drives it towards that. Whereas in a legal market where things are regulated and controlled, how much money is there in pure caffeine compared to coffee? You know, Starbucks could legally put rails of caffeine powder on the counter and encourage you to snort caffeine off the counter at Starbucks if they wanted to. No law against that at all. But they don't do that because their customers don't want that. They want coffee because coffee's delicious and it has a nice effect, and it's what people want, right? And in the world where coca and cocaine were legal, the coca shops could put cocaine rails out on the counter, but no one would want them. They'd want to drink coca tea and coca drinks because that's what people really would prefer under that situation, right? And so that's my message.
Yeah. Hey, I got one last question for you, but you reminded me of something else. We had recently had somebody that was in prison for the last like 8 years, and one of the things he told me was that it was like that he did get weed once, but it was easier, and he didn't do this, but he said a lot of the other people did, to get this like synthetic form of cannabis that came in on like a postcard because it's here again,
Yeah.
it's just easier to send into the fucking prison, and then they
Just
like
spray the liquid on the postcard. Yeah.
yeah, they like shred up the paper and it's horrible, but it gets them high and it gives them an
Well,
escape.
and trying to smoke weed in a prison is also very challenging because it's going to make a lot of smell. It's
Smell,
very
exactly.
obvious. Even you gotta plug into the power system to get some flame going. And when Mark Emery was in jail, he told me there'd be blackouts every once in a while because somebody would use their power, hack into the prison power system to make a lighter or something. They ended up knocking out all the power, right?
Right.
But yeah, absolutely. You know, and of course, the reality is you can get drugs in prison, which means if we turn our whole society into a prison, we're still going to have drugs, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't keep, you know, Charles Manson, you know, was caught getting marijuana in prison. If Charles Manson could get marijuana in prison, how are we going to stop anybody else from getting drugs in our society? The reality is we can't. What we can do is make it so that the easier, milder forms are more accessible and the harder, more dangerous forms are harder to get, and encourage people with education and with regulation towards the milder forms, right? We do that with alcohol, we do it with coffee very successfully. It would work with every other substance as well. But yeah, turning a society into a prison is not going to stop drug use because drugs are rampant in prisons. And that's part of why this whole mandatory treatment thing is such a ridiculous situation because treatment centers are that's often where you meet other drug users and you meet dealers and you
Right.
meet people like that. You know, that's where you want to go to get you clients. And it's also not uncommon for someone to go through a mandatory treatment. And when they're released, they say a bunch of lies. Yeah, I'll never do it again. Whatever you say to get out of there. And then as soon as they get out, they go back to using drugs. But now their tolerance is low. And so the amount that it takes to kill them is a lot smaller. And it's not uncommon for people to die after coming out of forced treatment. They go back to using drugs, and now their supply is disrupted, their tolerance has been changed, and they can hurt themselves, you know. And uh, yeah, I think it shouldn't be about drug use. It should be about responsible drug use. It's possible to use alcohol responsibly. It's possible to use cannabis responsibly, and it's possible to use psychedelics and opiates and stimulants responsibly as well. And most people will do that given the option. And the goal should be to make it easy to use these things responsibly and encourage responsible use. And part of that is ending prohibition. It is
Mhm.
key to that. Prohibition makes it very, very difficult. It's very difficult to be a responsible fentanyl user because fentanyl is just so potent, so difficult to work with. But it's not that hard to be a responsible opium user, you know, in that regard because it's milder and easier to go. It's like it's hard to be a methyl alcohol responsible methyl alcohol user or responsible Everclear drinker or whatever, right? Like the really strong, potent forms of alcohol, because it's very difficult to use in that kind of way. So yeah, that's what it's about.
Yeah. Well, hey, last question. The last time we talked, you mentioned you were going to open up an opium cafe. Did that ever materialize? Did you get anywhere with that?
Well, I got a lot of dreams and a lot of plans, and I'd like to do that one day. I still believe that would be a wonderful thing to do. It's very challenging.
Sure.
The psychedelic end of things is challenging as well, but it's also an area where we can have more success. So I have a lot of ideas. I would love to supply a safe supply of opiates to those who need it, and I would love to make an opium cafe or an opium parlor of some kind. That's on the back burner right now. My goal is to rebuild our psychedelic business to get the coca leaf back in
Sure.
stock and keep the coca growing. But I would love to do that, and it's on the list of things, and I'm going to get to that eventually.
Mhm.
But it's going to take me a while still to get there, and probably it would suffer some serious legal repercussions as well. Like our lawyer tells me. I mean, he doesn't ever encourage me to break the law, but he does point out the risks of running a psychedelic dispensary are very real, and I do risk my freedom and my liberty and my fortune or our business and everything is challenged by that. But an opium parlor would be much more risky, and I'm not averse to risk, and I'm into it, but I think that's not going to happen anytime soon. I've got another year
Gotcha.
or two on this direction as first, but I'll get to that eventually. That'll be part of the process.
Yeah. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Well, cool. Dana,
Yeah.
I look forward to maybe making a tour happen of your businesses. I'd like to come up to Vancouver. It'd be really cool. Check out what it's like, a little taste of freedom, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
we do have
just
some new projects in the works too that, I'm going to opening some new outlets and new things. So when you come up, there'll be some new things to see as well.
cool. Cool. We'll keep fighting the good fight. I appreciate you, Dana, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Cole Memo. You want just give you the space. Any final words?
Well, thanks for having me on. If people want to check me out, I'm at danalarson.com, mushroomdispensary.com. I write some funny books. They're at green or harrypothead.net or what's my Green Buds and Hash is one of my books. Potheadbooks.com is our website if you want to see the things I write. And I'm on YouTube at Dank Arson, YouTube Dank Arson. So feel free to come check me out.
Awesome. Yeah, folks, as always, all those links will be in the show notes. Definitely check him out and support Dana. He's a good follow and, makes a lot of great materials on the cannabis industry. So, and much more, not just the cannabis industry, but much more. So yeah, thank you again for what you've done and for what you continue to do, dude. If you don't already know, check out our last episode. I'll have that in the show notes as well. We go through a lot of Dana's past and advocacy and stuff. So, um, cool,
Thanks for
Dana.
having me on.
Yep. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.
Okay, bye for now.